Welcome to the Breakout Growth Podcast, where Sean, Ellis, and Ethan Garr interview leaders from the world's fastest-growing companies to get to the heart of what's really driving their growth. And now, here are your hosts, Sean Ellis and Ethan Garr.
In this week's episode of the Breakout Growth Podcast, Ethan Garr and I chat with Teresa Torres, a product discovery coach and author of the very popular book, Continuous Discovery Habits. So I was recently a guest on Lenny's podcast, and if you're not familiar with Lenny's podcast, I highly recommend it. It's probably my favorite podcast. I don't know. How about you, Ethan?
That's my second favorite behind this podcast called the Breakout Growth Podcast, Sean.
Okay, yeah, we don't really need to plug ours. They're already listening to it. But yeah,
Lenny's is fantastic.
It is a fantastic podcast. And so as I was getting ready to go on the podcast, I re-listened to some of his earlier episodes and came across Teresa's again, one that I had listened to previously. But when I heard it this time, I was thinking, man, we really need to get her on our podcast to talk about product discovery and particularly how it relates to growth. So Ethan, what stood out for you from this conversation?
For me, it was about that word continuous. She really believes that continuous customer engagement to inform product decisions is key. It's really fundamental to success. And she developed her framework to help businesses turn that into action. So turning feedback loops into a continuous process to inform the path to product market fit, to inform prioritization with things like ICE scoring, and so on. It just feels super aligned, Sean, with how you and I think about and approach growth every day. So it's clearly an important dimension that every growth team should be thinking about as they refine their own approach.
Yeah, for sure. I think most people agree that customer feedback is one of the most high leverage tools for companies looking to drive growth, but it's more than just running surveys and saying you're customer centric. It's really about taking action on the insights that you're getting. And teams, I've seen it over and over again, teams get busy and they get too busy to really get that customer voice and bring it into all of their decision making. And it's one of the most powerful things that you can do to drive improvement in the company. So you really should be doing it.
I think it's the most powerful thing you can do. I mean, it's just amazing what talking to customers will do to figure out what the right things to build are. So, I think that's what I really appreciate about Teresa's coaching on this. She made it really approachable. She suggests things like teams pick just one habit at a time to focus on building. Talks about getting out of this mindset that there's only one right answer out there. Talks about the importance of testing assumptions. Somehow, when she explains it, it doesn't feel daunting. It just sounds and feels exciting.
Yeah, I think that's the right word to capture this conversation. We both felt excited by what we learned in speaking with Teresa. It's all about asking the right questions and testing the right assumptions so that you're building and testing the right things, the things that matter to your customers. So I recently started blogging again on Substack, and one of the articles I recently wrote was about the importance of curiosity as a mindset for growth professionals. And this is something that Teresa emphasizes again and again throughout our conversation.
Yeah, you and I have talked a lot about curiosity over the years. And by the way, I thought it was a great article. And I think we'll make sure to link it in our show notes because I think our audience will really appreciate it as well. But I think it's time to let our audience hear just how awesome this conversation with Teresa was. What do you think?
Absolutely. Let's jump in with Teresa Torres and hear more about continuous product discovery. Hi, Teresa. It's great to have you on the Breakout Growth Podcast. Ethan and I are excited to dive into product discovery with you. Particularly, we want to try to connect it to engagement, which is obviously a key lever of growth. And so that's one of our big goals of this conversation.
Excellent. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, joined by Ethan Garr. Hey, Ethan.
Hey, Sean. Hey, Teresa. Yeah, Teresa, I've been really looking forward to this one. So let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
Yes. So, Teresa, you've obviously been a key voice in advancing product discovery. Your book is really popular. I was looking on Amazon and seeing how many reviews you had there, and we're at 750,000 books sold. A lot of it non-English versions of our book, but I think you have twice as many Amazon reviews as my book. So if there's any proxy on books sold, that's awesome. Congrats on that. So, so for anyone who doesn't know your background as much and what you're doing, can you tell us a bit about how Product Talk is helping companies build more customer-centric products and ideally, if you can tie a bit into what you're doing to help drive user engagement.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to think about this is I think as an industry, we're seeing a big shift to more from outputs to outcomes. So instead of just building things, starting to think about what's the impact those things are having. And then I think we're also seeing companies realize if they want to scale, if they want to have a lot of impact, decision making is getting pushed down to more product teams. But product teams aren't always equipped to handle both of those changes, right? They're used to be giving a roadmap of build these features, and now they're being asked to impact these outcomes. And so I think continuous discovery is really about our products are never done. We're always going to be looking to improve them. There's always more engagement we can drive. We can always acquire more customers. We can always retain more customers. How do we do that continuously? And how do we build, the way that I look at that is how do we build fast feedback loops with our customers so that we're always learning with them, we're designing with them, we're creating with them, so that we're sure that what we're doing matters. And I kind of got into this just because I spent most of my full-time employee experience in the San Francisco Bay Area working at early stage startups. I saw the exact same mistakes everywhere. Product teams didn't know very much about their customers. They weren't talking to them. Everything was very founder vision led, which can get you somewhere, not always where you intend. And I just wanted to start chipping away at it. Can we help teams be a little bit more customer centric? And so for the last 13 years, I've been working as a product discovery coach.
Awesome.
Very cool. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe what you've seen evolve in that time in terms of product discovery? And I mean, obviously, just in that time as a product guy, I've seen a lot change. And like you said, sort of that decision-making being pushed down to product. So I'm curious, like what you've seen in terms of that evolution since then.
Yeah, I think there's some big arcs that even predate my time as a coach. I would say as an employee, what I saw happening in the world, like in the early 2000s, it was sort of the rise of UX. We saw a lot of debates about design, information architecture, interaction design, visual design. All of that kind of came together into the UX role. And that helped a lot because I think UXers did a lot for advancing, hey, maybe we should get feedback from customers on our designs. And then that started to trickle across the organization. I think another big inflection point was the Lean Startup by Eric Ries. He sort of introduced this idea of assumption testing, fast cycles, don't build too much, learn before you build, although I think his cycle starts with build, but learn quickly, let's just put it that way. And then I think really the biggest catalyst has been as companies become, let's say, internet native, like they're really thinking about delivering value over the internet, our ability to measure impact has just gone through the roof. Like we literally can measure where we're losing people, where people fall off, what's not going as expected. And I think that's raised some awareness around, oh, things don't always have the impact we thought they would.
Right.
How do we get better at this? And then I think when we ask the question, how do we get better at this? We started from a project world of like, let's do big usability studies. Let's do big research projects. And I think in the last 5 to 10 years, we're seeing a shift to smaller, more continuous activities as opposed to these large project-based activities.
Is most of your coaching on kind of like products right in the early stage and trying to get them to product market fit, or is it more about just the ongoing evolution of products?
All of the above.
Okay.
Here was my goal. When I started to think about how do we help teams just be more customer-centric, increase their hit rate. What really got me started on this path was learning like what percentage of startups fail. And it blew my mind. I was like, how in the world is this the world we live in? And so that was sort of the catalyst that got me thinking about like, how do we make better decisions? How do we reduce the error rate? And I think a lot of my employee experience with small early stage startups, like I was the 10th employee one place, the 23rd another place, just a lot of 0 to 1.
Yeah.
But a lot of my coaching was larger companies. And when I first started coaching at larger companies, I had a little bit of like imposter syndrome, like what can I teach these companies? The largest company I ever worked at had 100 people. But I quickly learned it's the same problem. It's the same challenge, right? Like ultimately in product, we're trying to get customers to behave in a certain way. Hopefully in a way that creates value for them, but ultimately we're trying to get them to behave in a certain way. And it doesn't matter if it's 0 to 1 or if it's 99 to 100. It's or whatever number we want to put on mature products. It's really about humans and getting humans to do things and helping humans understand things and helping humans get more value out of things.
I just wanted to follow up. I think people are always talking about being customer centric, and I feel like sometimes it becomes just a buzzword because people, it's like we're customer centric, but it has no depth. What do you think is really the key to making for product teams that want to be more customer centric? What do you think? Like, obviously, product discovery is important to that, but can you dive in a little bit about what really drives a true, authentic customer centric experience?
Yeah, customer-centric is becoming one of those words that doesn't mean anything. Because everybody is customer-centric, right? For me, it's not just about customer centricity, because this is where I think some of the UX community gets it wrong, right? There's this belief that if I just create value for my customers, I've done my job. Whereas what I think is really important is to make sure we're creating both customer value and business value. And that if we're not doing both, we're doing a disservice to our customers. It's a little bit counterintuitive, right? If I create customer value, but I don't create business value, what happens? My product is going to get shut down. Companies aren't charities, right? And so I think aligning those two is really critical. And so for me, what does that look like? It means I have to understand my business context. I have to understand how my product supports the business context. That's usually how does my product generate revenue or save costs, reduce costs for my company. And then I have to look at how do I understand how I can create customer value, something that's valuable for my customer in a way that aligns with that business value. And that's a lot of my product discovery framework is really designed around how do we align those things? How do we make sure that every product team understands how to create value for the customer so that they're satisfied, but also creates value for the business. And that usually means the customer is so satisfied, they're going to open their wallet and pay for something.
Yeah, and I think the value piece, obviously, like that comes back to product market fit. It's just like, is there enough value in there in the first place to actually get people using it and sticking around? And obviously, as you said, the business value is going to require monetizing in the right way and building a real business around it. With our focus on this podcast on growth, a lot of that then becomes how do we make sure enough people are experiencing that value in the right way. And so I'm curious if you've looked at ways to tie customer discovery to actually improving user engagement or other things that relate to growth.
Yeah, I think, feel free to push back on this, because I know there's been a long dance in the product growth marketing worlds of where's overlap, who owns what. I don't care who owns what.
Same, yeah.
Here's how I think about growth, right? To grow, I can acquire customers. I can reduce the customers that I'm losing. I can retain the customers I have. I can grow the size of my customers, whether that's through net retained revenue or growing seats or whatever, right? To me, those are all outcomes. So if I have a product team that's tasked with one of those areas, or maybe even all of those areas, as we see at smaller companies, I want to look at, okay, I know the business need is retain more customers or acquire more customers. That's easy. I now need to do the work to understand who are the right customers, who's going to get value from what we have today, and or what do we need to add to our product? What value do we need to add to our product to go find more customers? Right? And so there's a little bit of this how do we discover what's working today and how many people match that? And is there more capacity in our current market? In which case, great, I just need to go find more people like that.
Right. And then how does customer discovery actually help you find those answers?
Yeah, so in my framework, so let's back up. One of my goals, I didn't set out to think I'm going to come up with this product discovery framework. What I did was I just started talking to teams and I started coaching teams. And one of the things that I learned really early in my career, actually in college, was interviews and to interview people and to learn about their lives and to make it about them. We're designing for them. We better know who they are, right? And I just started getting teams doing this, and a few things started to happen. When you start interviewing customers, first of all, you have to know what to ask, which a lot of people don't. Like, our intuition doesn't always get us reliable feedback. So there's sort of this art of interviewing.
Yeah.
And then even if you learn what to ask, you get pretty quickly overwhelmed with everybody's a little bit different. There's a ton of things you could do. How do we decide what to do? Or worse, everybody looks exactly the same, which means you're probably falling prey to confirmation bias and not actually learning from your customers, right? And so then there was this sort of second challenge of like, what do I do with all this stuff? And then there was this third challenge of like, it's great, this is interesting, but my business wants me to ship something tomorrow, and I need to start building.
Right.
And so really what happened pretty organically of just working with teams, I started to look at like, how do we add scaffolding around these three things? Like, how do we help teams ask the right questions? How do we help them synthesize what they're learning and make it really actionable? And then how do we help them determine if their ideas for what to build are actually addressing those things? And that's sort of the heart of my framework. So I start with, you have to have an outcome. You have to know what success looks like. Where are we headed? You have to interview. As you interview, you're going to hear about all sorts of unmet customer needs, pain points, and desires. How do we synthesize that and make a strategic decision about where do we want to play? And then we have to explore solutions. And as we explore solutions, we're looking for a match between those things. Does a solution address this need in a way that drives our business outcome? And I use assumption testing for that. And that's just building on Eric Ries's world. I didn't make that up. It's just a thing that was already out there. And I think a lot of what I did was how to make that really actionable for teams as opposed to a vague concept. So I would say discovery is that simple. It's we're starting with an outcome. We're talking to our customers to learn about what they need. We're evaluating solutions based on how well do they match those needs.
And I assume ultimately testing those solutions for how effective they are.
Yeah, so part of evaluating solutions, this is one of the big changes I think with moving from a project world to a more continuous world. When we talk about testing solutions, what I see happen is teams build a bunch of stuff and they A/B test it. And then they learn they built the wrong thing. And what I don't love about that is you just did all the work before you learned you were on the right track.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So I do love A/B testing. I think it's a great measurement tool. But I don't want teams to build everything. I don't even want teams to do all the design work before they know they're on the right track. And I think Eric Ries hinted at this in the Lean Startup. He more than hinted at it, but I think a lot of people miss the message, which is you don't have to test your whole solution. You can break it down into its underlying assumptions and do assumption testing. And that we can assumption test much quicker. We can test multiple ideas. I think that really unlocks just better decision making. So when I talk about evaluating solutions, I prefer to do that through really rapid fire assumption testing.
One other just quick before I bring Ethan in, and I'm sure you're chomping at the bit with some questions, Ethan. I'm curious. A lot of times when I talk about improving engagement, there's a really tactical model that can help with that, and that's Uriel's hooked model. Clearly, it feels like you're ultimately trying to kind of understand the drivers underneath that model instead of just kind of thinking through. But are there any other kind of limitations to that model, or do you feel like that model complements what you're talking about? Is it, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to say I've always thought this about growth, but I could replace growth with product. I think it's the same. Not that growth and product are the same, but this statement applies equally to both. So I think we can look at growth from a really narrow optimizing lens. And for a lot of us, we get a ton of value out of that. That's where our low-hanging fruit is. We often see, this is where we see the blog posts about, I changed this call to action and I got a 400% increase in my conversion rate, right? Like, I'm not poo-pooing that because there is a lot of wins there, and I think we often underestimate those wins. But I think there's another scope, and that's, are we even in the right ballpark? Did we build the right thing? Is this the right value? Can we get a better value fit? And that's where like conversion rate optimization isn't going to get you there. There's a little bit more of like, I need to understand the humans I'm impacting, the humans I'm designing for and hopefully with, and really see, and this is where we see, I would call them more, I want to say step function change, but don't take that to mean bigger impact. Because sometimes we get a huge impact from those little optimizations, right?
Right.
But it's more of like, instead of being in this lane optimizing it, we might learn there's a lane right next to us.
Right.
That
Kind of local maxima versus like kind of much bigger opportunity on the next mountain over.
And I would say that like all the habits I write about in my book, and I named the book Continuous Discovery Habits because I want people to think about it as a collection of habits. Like it's not a rigorous process or framework that you adhere to perfectly. It's here's some tools in your toolbox. And I think all of those habits apply even in the optimization realm, right? So like if I'm trying to optimize a checkout flow, I'm still going to benefit from talking to people who recently purchased about their experience.
Right.
I'm still going to benefit from assumption testing. But if I expand my scope and say, okay, I actually want to know, are we offering the right products? Is that how I can get people to buy more? Okay, well now I can interview people about what they're looking for, and I can assumption test around new products to add. So my goal was not to like come up with a framework that we should all be dogmatic about and argue about, is this way better than this way? My goal was to look at like, what's the underlying framework that underpins all of our work? Right? And it's really like, I really draw from problem solving and decision making research because I feel like that's what makes this universal, is that we're essentially solving problems and we're making decisions. So how do we do that well?
So as teams adopt continuous discovery, how do you see them measuring like the real impact on metrics? How do you see, like, are there key signals that they should always be looking for?
I think there's two ways to think about this. So the first is we're learning how to be a continuous discovery team. How do we track our progress? And then the second is continuous discovery is designed to help a team drive an outcome. So the ultimate measure of continuous discovery is, are we impacting that outcome? That can be a lagging indicator. And that's why in this sort of learning process, some of the things I like to look at is, are you doing the right activities? So are you interviewing regularly? Are you running assumption tests regularly? How is your outcome providing focus? Or is it just a thing that you set and then you do all the other things that you were going to do anyway? And then ultimately, what I like to do in that learning phase is, before you release anything, literally anything, take some time to document, why did you build this? What impact did you expect it to have? And then a week later, 30 days later, 6 months later, whatever the right time frame is, revisit it. Did it have that impact? And when teams do this, they realize lots of stuff didn't have the impact they thought. And then when we realize that, we can ask, why not? What was the gap? What assumption did we get wrong? And then that's a feedback loop on how well did we do in our discovery, right? And so I don't think we're ever going to be perfect. I don't think we're ever going to release things that always have the exact impact we thought, but I think we can get closer.
Is there, as teams adopt this, is there one key mistake that you see a lot of them make? Is there something that you've learned along the way that you're like, if you can avoid this, you're going to be a lot more successful?
I think the big one, if I had to pick one, language is so vague. Let me tell you a story. I started coaching teams, and a team would show up for a coaching session for the first time, and they'd say, Teresa, we already do continuous discovery. I'd be like, great, let's talk about what you're doing. And what they would describe is they were doing usability testing, or they were getting pulled in on sales calls, or they were good at A/B testing. Like they were doing activities that a lot of us would put in the discovery bucket. But there was nothing continuous about it. And one of the things that I like to look for is, are you throwing ideas away? Like you could do all the right activities, but if you're not changing your mind about anything, those activities aren't having an impact. So I think the big mistake teams make is they get stuck in a project world. They sort of miss the continuous part, and they're occasionally doing big discovery activities and haven't really found this continuous cadence. We see the same thing when companies adopt Agile, right? They move from this like big, heavy waterfall process to, I think Marty Kagan calls it mini waterfall. Like they're doing 2-week sprints, but they're still planned 6 months ago. It's a little bit of that, like they miss the continuous mindset part of it. And then because of that, they're not really learning from their activities. They're still doing what they would have always done.
So one of the things that I like to do when I approach growth is I'll kind of pick an area of the business that feels like we're underperforming in that area for whatever reason. Like we don't retain customers. I feel like we could retain them much better. There's a lot of different ways we could potentially do that, but maybe we set the goal of improving that. And then what I found, if I just randomly go in and start experimenting, I might get some wins, but it's not going to be that great. But I've learned over time that if I can like deeply contextualize the situation, deeply understand what's happening there, maybe where the customer's having a problem, why they're not coming back, why they are coming back, that the experiments we run tend to have a lot higher potential impact, but it still doesn't necessarily lead to the perfect solution based on that deep context. So I still do find the need to have 3 or 4 solutions that I might be wanting to test, and one ends up performing a lot better than the others. So I'm curious if you see that kind of experimentation as part of this process, or is it that generally enough context, the solution you come up with, it's kind of like, did it lift results or not? Roll it back if it didn't, keep it if it did, or are you kind of simultaneously testing potentially more than one solution?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest things I hammer home, is I want people comparing and contrasting.
Okay.
I want them comparing and contrasting at the outcome level. What if we tripled retention, or like reduced churn by 3x? What if we acquired 3x more customers? Right? Where's our leverage? What outcome should we be focused on? I want them comparing and contrasting when we're talking about user needs and pain points and desires. Like, how much does the customer care about this? If we address this one versus this one, how does it change our position in the market? And then once we choose an opportunity or a customer need to go after, I want teams comparing and contrasting solutions. I get asked all the time, like, hey, I ran this test. This was my conversion rate. Is that good enough? I don't know. Or like,
if it's 100%.
Yeah, I ran a prototype test and I got feedback. How do I make sense of it? You know, like, we tend to think about like in absolute. I think we're trained to think in absolutes. Like, we grew up going to school. There's a right answer.
Yeah.
And I think what we see in business is there's lots of good answers.
Yeah.
Some are better than others. And the only way to really evaluate things is to compare and contrast. And when I said I like to draw from decision-making research, this is really grounded. Like, we have decades of decision-making research that suggests if we compare and contrast, we make better decisions. The challenge is most product teams, and probably growth teams too, like, have full backlogs and are drowning in work. And when you tell them, like, test more than one idea, they go, yeah, right, I don't have time for that.
Right.
And that's where this concept of don't test your ideas, test their underlying assumptions,
Right.
makes this sustainable. I work with teams that test multiple assumptions in a single day, because that's the goal. We're going to frame our assumptions so small that we can test them really quickly, and then that starts to give us the data we need to compare and contrast.
One of the things I found in my last hands-on role with a company called Bounce was that we initially had that feedback. We're just so busy, we can't really implement this as an A/B test. Let's just implement it. We'll analyze the data, see if it improved against the goal, the output goal that we're trying to do. And what we found is that there's so much noise that almost everything was inconclusive. In which case, like, for that extra 20% of work, we kind of got no learning versus at least some. Even if you're like before and after testing, like we make a change and try to see does customer behavior change based on that change. And so fortunately over time we did move a lot more toward everything that we wanted to introduce to try to set it up as a test so that we actually could see the incremental outcome on before or after, or solution A versus solution B. And interesting. I mean, and it was a very integrated effort between growth and product, and ultimately a lot of the product teams features and other things they were releasing, we ended up following that same methodology. So it's kind of everybody bought into we really don't know the answer until we release it and test it. And so yeah, it's I don't know if there's a question in there or just the observation of that ultimately it's really hard to predict customer behavior, and improving customer behavior I think you're much more likely to do that if you can deeply contextualize it and understand the customer needs. But validating a solution is tough without running it as a test. That's my own experience anyway.
Yeah, I think there's layers to this. So what I agree with what you said 100% is A/B testing is the best way to measure, did the thing we built have the impact we thought it would? Right? So we built this thing, we thought it would change behavior in this way, we're going to A/B test it. That is the gold standard of did that happen? The challenge with A/B testing, first of all, a large number of product teams work on products and or features that don't have enough traffic to A/B test in a reasonable amount of time.
Right, yeah.
Right? I don't want a team waiting a month to decide, was this the right thing to build? Now, if you built it and you're waiting a month to measure impact, that's fine.
Yeah.
But when you're deciding what to build, I want you to have fast feedback loops of, does this idea look better than this other idea? And that's where A/B testing, unless you're Google or Facebook or maybe Netflix, probably not even Netflix, right? Like, and even those companies, like even the companies with 1 billion users, 1 billion people don't use all the features. So you have to be working on a feature that 1 billion people use, right? Like relying on A/B testing to tell you what to build, you've done all the work up front, you're waiting forever. It's slow. Yeah. So I like to frame A/B testing as it's a measurement stick. Yeah. Like it's not informing, should we build this or not?
Right.
It's, we decided to build this. Did it have the impact we thought it would?
Yeah, and that's the view I'm looking at it as well.
Yeah.
Like it's after kind of validation or not quite what we expected to happen, but just some kind of a feedback loop to let you know.
And that's where like using that as a feedback loop of, did we miss something in our discovery? Yeah. And I always tell teams, you're always going to miss something in discovery. Like, it's really rare that you build a thing and it has exactly the impact you thought it would.
Sure.
Right? And so that is a really important feedback loop of like, hey, we saw this gap. Let's go back and look at what we explored in discovery. We missed this. How do we make sure we don't miss that the next time?
So I have a question related to that. So years ago, Sean came up with ICE scoring, impact, confidence, and effort. And you hear there's some variations on that. There's RICE and some others. I'm curious how that fits in with your thinking on this framework, because what you're describing is, be careful what you build, right? Like focus first on figuring out what to build. That process can be really good in organizing tests and prioritizing. Do you see a role for that kind of framework in what you do?
It depends. Here's what I like about those frameworks and all the variations on them. If you have stakeholders in a room, it starts to get out their underlying assumptions. We're assuming the effort is this. We're assuming the business impact is this. We're assuming the customer impact is this. What I don't like is if you're not testing those assumptions, you still just have a bunch of people in a room guessing at what they should build, right? So what I want to see is, okay, use that to have a really good conversation, and now let's go get some feedback. If we think it has this impact on customers, let's test that. So a lot of what I teach is, okay, so we have an idea. We want to build a thing. And in order to build this thing, we believe it's going to create value for the customer. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to use story mapping, the same idea popularized by Jeff Patton. Literally map out, what does the customer have to do to get value from that solution? It doesn't exist yet. It's just an idea on a whiteboard. Can we map out what the customer has to do to get value from that? Okay, we now have a map of everything we're assuming a customer will do. And if they are willing to do all those things, at the end, there's some value creation. Great. Now let's look at each step, and we can ask what needs to be true in order for a customer to take this step. That's how I'm generating my assumptions that my idea depends upon. It's one of the ways I'm generating the assumptions my ideas depend upon. And so I'm going to come up with things like, let's suppose that you work at a startup and you don't want to do identity management. So you're like, okay, let's use Google as our login. That's your idea. And then someone says, well, no, let's use Facebook as our login. I know that it's not really a thing anymore, but humor me. And there's a debate, right? And executives can sit in a room, or the product team can sit in a room and come up with, well, Google's API is easier, well, more people use Facebook, whatever, right? All assumptions. If we map out, okay, in order for this to be a successful way for people to log in, what does the customer actually have to do? Well, they have to go to our sign-up page. They have to see the options. They have to understand the options. They have to have one of those accounts. They have to select one. They have to do the little connection to make sure that I know what your Google ID is, right? We have to be able to store that accurately and abide by Google's API. Then when they come back, they have to remember that they selected Google and not Facebook. Okay, this is a really simple example. I just enumerated a dozen assumptions. So now we're having this debate. What if someone just went out and launched a little survey on your website and said, which of the following accounts do you have, Google or Facebook? Now I can learn in a day or two, do our customers use Google more or Facebook more? And instead of being in a room full of opinions that have no data whatsoever, I just collected data about my customers that's telling me which direction should I go, right? And I could do that for any of those assumptions so that I'm starting to learn like one of these options is better than the other.
So yeah, just to tie the two pieces together, the ICE scoring, as I envisioned it when I came out with it, was that confidence is largely going to be based on how much customer validation do you have in advance. Are customers struggling with this? Are they not? Yeah. So that ultimately you can increase your confidence in a solution based on spending more time analyzing with customers. If it's a really easy test to run, maybe it's easier to just run the test rather than spend the time on gathering that feedback, and that's always obviously debatable. And I'm a big proponent of customer feedback. I used to run Qualaroo and basically built that company to be able to gather feedback in user flow. My product market fit survey was all about I don't want to try to grow something until I can deeply understand how customers are getting value from it. And so sustainable growth, I think, is really about deeply understanding value and being able to double down on what matters to customers and fix the things that prevent them from getting to value. But that ultimately it does come down to the test. There's part of the process is that feedback loop from the test. But again, it's that's just my view on it.
If I've learned anything, it's the way that people use tools is not necessarily the way the tool is intended.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So like I said, I love it as a conversation starter. I love it, like you're saying, as like summarize what you've learned. It's just not what I see people do. I see too many teams throw out opinions. They put it in a spreadsheet.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It looks like the right answer, and then they're way overconfident in that right answer.
For sure. And what I advocate and what I see companies do is two completely different things. So I completely agree with you.
Same with my stuff. I mean, I argue with people constantly about please don't use generative AI to create your opportunity solution tree. You're kind of missing the point. But people do what they want to do. So.
Right. I think this ultimately comes down to at what point do you just run a test and get the feedback to see how behavior may change or not change based on a solution versus spending a lot of time on the customer feedback and just customer discovery to figure out what is the right solution to test. And do you have any thoughts on the kind of best way to balance that?
This is hard because I used to say if it's faster to run the test, run the test. Or if it's faster to build it, just build it.
Yeah.
But then I saw teams literally build 30 things in 30 days and they were 30 wrong things.
Right.
But we wasted a month, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a balance of both. I really want teams continuously engaging with customers. So one of the benchmarks that I set years ago was I like to see product teams doing a customer interview every week. We're just investing in our understanding of who our customer is incrementally over time. And then, of course, there's synthesis work that has to be happening. What are we learning over time? How is it changing? If you're doing that and you are looking at a solution and it literally is faster to build it than to really evaluate it, maybe you could say we do have a rich understanding of our customer and we should just build this. And there will be times that that's the right answer. But I think if a team has a pattern of just building it because it's fast,
right,
and they're measuring impact and they're realizing they're getting miss after miss after miss, maybe they should stop just building it because it's faster. Because it's not.
Right. And also tying back to something else you mentioned, just the sample sizes are so hard Just because it's easy to build doesn't mean that you should be using that sample size on something because you didn't take the time to figure out if your solution is tied to what customer needs are. And you can have lots of conversations, but you just don't have that much sample size to be testing different solutions in.
Yeah, this sample size problem is real.
Yeah, for sure.
Anytime somebody asks me yeah, but that's not a representative sample, I'm like, you don't have an audience. Your audience isn't big enough to even be talking about quantitative testing.
Yeah,
there's math here, and you're asking me a mathy question, but I don't think you understand the math behind the mathy question, right? There's just not. You have 100 users. We're not doing anything quantitative.
And that's a big part of the reason why I personally lean into consumer, just because it's more likely to have some volume there where I can actually get feedback from testing different solutions.
Once you have product market fit. Exactly.
Only after product market fit.
Plenty of
Definitely.
Companies that they're still struggling with have enough people, or they're an occasional use product. So maybe they have a lot of customers, but they don't have a lot of customers in a short window of time.
Right.
Right? And if we're continuously building, which is now the expectation in our industry, we are continuously building, you need to be continuously deciding what to build. So we need fast feedback loops, not these I see teams that are we'll know in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
I'm well,
we've sent it over to research and we'll have an answer back in a while.
Are you just not going to build anything for 6 weeks? Or are you going to build the wrong stuff for 6 weeks?
Right.
We can do better than that.
Yeah.
Do you find that a lot of what you end up coaching teams on is really how to listen to customers? I mean, it's the ideas of how do you go out and talk to customers is one thing, but I feel like a lot of the challenge I face when I'm coaching teams is how do we continuously ask the right questions in the same organized way so that we can start to spot trends? And it's a lot about listening. So I'm curious if that comes really into your into what you're espousing.
Yeah, there's a few things that I hammer on. One is how to ask the right questions. I really focus on teaching teams to collect specific stories about past behavior. And that sounds really simple. We can all know to ask, tell me about the last time you did this thing. That is not the work. Asking that question is easy. The problem is, if I say, tell me about the last time you watched Netflix, you're going to be like, I watched a movie last night after dinner. Cool story, right? That's not enough. There's this art of collecting a story and helping the participant remember their story and walking through it in enough detail to be useful to you, and asking it at the right scope so that you get the full context and you understand what their goals were, and not just tell me about the last time you used my product, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a ton around that. On the assumption testing side, there's a lot around research methods, and we see this with surveys. Sean, you probably saw this at Qualaroo. Survey data is only as good as the question you ask.
For sure.
And a lot of people, I know there's been decades now of people saying, don't ask people about their hypothetical future behavior. But what is our most popular customer satisfaction metric on earth? A hypothetical question about future behavior, right? We're just bad at this.
Uh-huh. Are you referring to the NPS question? I
am. When we have a perfectly valid, we have really good satisfaction measurements that we could have used instead, but that's a whole different side rant.
Absolutely.
And here's the thing. Actually, hypothetical future questions can be great sentiment metrics.
Yeah.
How do you feel about this thing? So the PMF survey is actually a really great sentiment metric, right? If this thing happened, how do you feel? That's great. What I don't like about NPS is how likely are you to do this behavior? Mm-hmm. We're terrible at predicting our future behavior. We're terrible at it, right? I can imagine if this thing went away, how do I feel about that? Because I'm feeling that, right?
Right.
I can't predict what I'm going to do tomorrow.
Yeah.
Not with good reliability. I just can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that kind of stuff. So we do a lot around mindset. We do a lot around research methods. On the mindset front, so many people still believe there is one best answer. There is a right answer. Mm. And there's a lot of work to undo there because there's not a right answer.
How much does curiosity play into that? Are people who are very curious better at asking the right questions, or is it really just, train the right way to ask questions, and that's all that matters.
I think curiosity matters a lot. I think I have a blog post about being curious.
That was my last blog post as well.
Yeah. There you go. I think it is a really critical trait, but the thing is, I think a lot of curious people may not be curious in their work because of their organizational context.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I could be a naturally curious person, but if I know my CEO is asking me to build this feature and I'm told to test it,
mm-hmm.
and I'm learning and there might be flaws in it, but I don't want to have to go tell the CEO their idea sucks, I'm not going to be that curious about those flaws. I'm going to look for why it could work, and I'm going to focus on that.
Confirmation bias kind of approach. Is it a cultural thing then that really executives should be looking to shape the culture in a way that people foster the right type of curiosity?
Yeah, I think this is what's so hard, right? I think it's easy for leaders to think my product teams aren't curious enough. My product teams don't have enough intellectual honesty. They don't have the scientific mindset. And they don't look at, well, you're incentivizing them not to do all those things, right? There is a skills gap. Like, there is legitimately a skills gap. So where those leaders are right is our product teams don't know how to do this, and we have to close that skills gap. But that's not the whole story. And I get hired to close the skills gap, and I have really hard conversations with leaders about, like, okay, I'm going to come in and I'm going to teach your teams. And they're going to get really excited about working this way, because frankly, it's a lot more fun than being told what to build.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't close your leadership gap, all that's going to happen is 100% turnover of your team. So are you sure you want me to come in and train your teams? And they think I'm crazy because it's like I don't want the business. And in a lot of ways, I don't want the business.
Right.
I'm not serious because
if you're not going to succeed with it, what's the point?
I'm pretty tired of seeing this, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's so Marty Kagan's new book, Transformed, he talks about at all levels of the organization what has to happen for product teams to start working this way. And I love that he did look at it top, like all the way from the top, all the way to the bottom. And I think people underestimate what's really required to create the environment to work this way.
Mm-hmm.
So is it really both a top-down and bottoms-up effort with teams, or do you always have to start with the executive team and work down? How do you approach that from a cultural perspective?
It's all of the above. So in an ideal world, which none of us live in, we would have a CEO who drank the Kool-Aid, who's driving the change, and everybody on their executive team, including the sales executive, would be on board, and they would train their teams, and every individual on those teams would be on board, and we would see even change across the organization. It never happens that way, right? Because a CEO maybe drank the Kool-Aid, but they're not individually doing the work of being ready to let go of their pet ideas. They haven't aligned their executive teams. They're still sort of infighting around, wait, what do you mean we're not going to do this feature request from this big revenue customer that asked for it? Maybe they upskill their teams, but during that training, their teams think it's just the flavor of the week and don't really commit to it, right? So even when it's top down, things can go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I have also seen stories where an individual product team changed the way they worked. They found a way to do this in their feature factory, weird organizational context, and they inspired change in the organization. They had a bigger impact. Other people got curious about what they were doing. So my takeaway is this simple: change is really hard. Like, it's really hard. So what I encourage people to do, whether you're a leader or an individual contributor, start with yourself. Change your own habits. Let people get curious about what you're doing. When they're curious about what you're doing, that's when you have the impact to influence.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that there's certain situations that you'd prefer not to go into because your chances of success are pretty low. So I'm curious, like, and then you took it all the way down to change yourself first. Is there an organization that's sort of the ideal organization for you to go be able to step in there and make enough changes that they can really embrace this approach of customer discovery and see real impact on their goals? That's sort of like, oh yes, this is the one I want to dive into and work on next.
So, like in Transformed, Marty Kagan outlines like 3 things an organization needed to change. This is a very simplified model, but I think he did a pretty good job with it. He talks about, let's see if I can get him right. We have to change the way that we deliver. So that's like the basics of continuous deployment, right? Like, do you have automations in place? Are you doing nightly builds? Does it take 2 weeks for a release engineer to get a release out the door? Like, are you good in that realm? And I remember 20 years ago, I worked at a startup that was like pushing to get to nightly builds. And I'm a little bit amazed that in 2024, this is not universal, but it's not, right? Like, our engineering practices need to mature.
Yeah.
The second thing he says is we have to change the way we decide what to build. We have to change which problems we choose to solve, and then we have to change the way we decide what to build. And so he puts the deciding what problems to solve at the leadership level. What is messy about his language, and I don't love it, even though I think he got it right, is I don't think leaders think about them as choosing problems to solve. A lot of leaders dictate solutions. Let's walk through a real world example. So Spotify recently, a couple years ago, decided to make a bet on podcasts, right? They didn't start with an outcome. They didn't like tell their product teams, we're going to just drive engagement. They made a bet. They said, we're going to put a lot of money. We want to win at podcasts. That's a solution, right? So some people would argue they did it wrong in this empowered model. I don't think that's true at all. Because if we say we're making a bet on podcasts, there's still a billion, if not a trillion, downstream decisions that need to be made about how we're going to win at podcasts.
Right, okay.
So for me, and like we're seeing the same argument at Airbnb with product managers versus product marketers and how much control and founder mode and how much micromanagement. I actually think this is entirely the wrong conversation. I think leaders are always going to make bets. They're always going to say we're going to go into podcasts. There's still a trillion decisions that have to happen downstream, and we want those teams empowered to learn how to make those decisions in the best way for the customer and the business. So I think the better question is not founder mode versus manager mode or empowered versus not or micromanaged versus not. It's about, given where we are as an organization, how narrow or wide of a scope do we want to give our teams? And when you have a ton of cash, you can give your teams lots of scope, right? Because you're like a VC. You're having your teams go off and explore, and your organization can afford a lot of exploration. And when cash is not flush and it's a little tighter, guess what you need to move? You need to move to exploiting. And what's going to happen? We're going to give all our teams a narrower scope, right? And so, like, I really think about this more as the, like, who was it, Marsh, the explorer versus exploit guy? It's like, if you're not familiar with it, it's like a classic business school article about managing innovation in an organization. How much you explore versus how much you exploit what's already working. And I think, like, so in order for this to work, leaders have to be conscious about that decision. And there is no organization on earth, including Steve Jobs running Apple, there is no organization on earth where a leader made every single decision, right? Teams do have to make decisions. So continuous discovery to me is how do we help them make better decisions at whatever scope they're making them at. And it's up to the leaders to decide, like, how much scope do we want to give our teams?
So I know we're running short on time. I wanted to ask you, just as you have really led this field, what does your own continuous learning process look like? How do you stay curious and continue to improve yourself?
Yeah, a lot of ways. For my work with my products, I literally follow the exact same framework I teach. So I interview product people every week. I have a community of product people. It's just a Slack community. We do monthly calls. So that's sort of a more continuous, just constantly engaging with people. The purpose of the community is for them to get help putting the habits into practice. So then that's great feedback on my content and on my curriculum and on my book, because I see where there's gaps. I am constantly running assumption tests in my community, on social media, with my blog posts, with our course content. Like right now I'm designing a new course, and I actually integrated all of the content into an existing course because our alumni get access to it. So it was just a way to get real live feedback on how the content is performing before I offer it as a separate course. And then I take inspiration from everywhere. So I read a lot. Blogs, books. I listen a little bit. I'm not a huge podcaster because I'm not a very good audio learner. But I'm starting to, there's such good podcast content out there, so I'm starting to integrate it. But yeah, I live by the always be learning kind of mantra.
Yeah, I think you and I have the benefit of both being alumni from Lenny's podcast. It's that's one of my favorite ones for learning. There's so much good stuff on there.
You know what? I shouldn't say this publicly, but it's one of the few that I listen to every episode.
Yeah,
I mean, I
same.
can say that publicly because Lenny's great, but
Yeah.
there's so many friends I have that have podcasts. That
Yeah.
I'm like, ugh.
My intent is to listen to a lot more, but that's the must listen.
It takes my whole brain to pay attention to auditory content. It's like I've learned this as an adult. I wish I knew this when I was in school.
Yeah.
Like I really can't, like people will go on a walk and listen to a podcast.
Yeah.
I will have no idea what I just heard. Either that or I'll run into a street sign. Like it literally takes my whole brain to listen. Whereas reading for me is not that way. So podcasts are tough for me. But I started using Readwise Reader, and Readwise Reader will turn anything into a transcript.
Oh,
so
I like it. Yeah.
I now have started reading podcasts, so that's great.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you have any, I mean, that's how you go about your own learning. And do you have any recommendation for people who want to get stronger in discovery themselves, how they can build those skills?
Yeah. Obviously the book is a good place to start. So if you don't have it, it's Continuous Discovery Habits. My tip for people for how to get good at this, pick one habit at a time. Too many people think I gotta completely radically change the way that I work. And I don't recommend that. Like that's not the way that we change. So what I recommend is look at the set of habits, find one that you think would be the easiest for you to adopt given your organizational context, and start there. And then when it's ingrained in the way that you work, pick your next habit. And then there's a lot of great resources. So I blog at producttalk.org. I think I have almost 300 articles. Most of them are long form. They're meant to be actionable. We share a lot of stories about how other teams are putting these ideas into practice. And then product discovery is really trendy right now. So if my stuff doesn't resonate, find somebody whose stuff does, right? Like there's so many people writing in this space. There's a lot of overlap with the growth community. There's a lot of overlap.
Who's one of your favorites on other people that are writing on this?
Let's see. Good question. I have so many. So first of all, we already mentioned Lenny. I think every person in the product space should be listening to his podcast. He's a phenomenal interviewer, a lot of really great content. Pay for his subscription because his behind the paywall stuff is amazing.
I've started paying as well.
Yeah, he's raising the bar for all of us. I'm kind of mad at him. I'm like, come on, Lenny. That's good.
My first feedback to Ethan was, man, if we want to really be as successful as Lenny with a podcast, we got a lot of work to do. That guy works really hard.
He does work really hard. If people aren't familiar with Marty Kagan's books, where I think he excels, he is the best missionary this industry has. Like, if you just need a dose of inspiration, any of his books help with that. On the tactical side, choose who you learn from wisely. I feel like with LinkedIn kind of taking over for where Twitter left off, there's so many people trying to build a personal brand by just repackaging other people's stuff. And there's a lot of misinterpretation. It's like what we talked about with ICE. So like, I encourage everybody to go to primary sources. Even with my own stuff, like in my book, I tried to cite my primary sources. Right? Because I don't want you to just take my word for it. I want you to dig in and like come up with your own model. So I think it's less about who and more about how. Like if you see an idea that resonates with you, do the work to figure out where it came from and is it evidence-based and does it work in different organizational contexts? Because I think that's really how we learn.
Look no further than the Eric Ries and what people think an MVP is.
I mean that team is now useless, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I think that it comes back to curiosity. Like don't just because I say something doesn't mean it's true. Like I sold some books, who cares, right? Like take it as an idea and play with it and try it out and see if it works and learn where the idea came from.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're a little bit over time here, so we'll ask you our final question and wrap up. But this has been great, Teresa. I really enjoyed it. Is there anything you feel you understand about improving engagement and retention today that maybe you didn't know a couple of years ago?
You got to play with scope. So we talked about this a little bit. There's sort of the optimizing scope, but then there's also the are we even in the right lane scope? Mm-hmm. And I think maybe in the early days of this, I thought you could focus on one or the other, and we're going to go through this optimizing period, and then we're going to go through this exploration period. Whereas what I think works really well is to be continuously doing both. Mm-hmm. And so you can even think about it as we're going to spend a percentage of our time on optimizing and a percentage of our time on bigger, bolder, more exploratory bets. And I think that you learn from the feedback between the two, which I think is really valuable.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, so I have some takeaways, but Ethan, do you have any takeaways before I jump into mine?
Yeah, one thing that just stood out to me, Teresa, is that I think you've put a lot of thought and effort into how to do continuous discovery well. But I really appreciate that you look at it as a framework and not dogma. It's not, there's one way to do this, you have to fall into this. I feel like there's a lot of things out there like OKRs, for example, where it's there's a lot of very if you don't do it this way, and then I think it makes it really hard for people to be successful with it. So I really appreciate the fact that you've given us sort of this, not, I wouldn't say general, but this loose framework of pieces to put together and given us a really good sense of how that all works together. So that was really helpful for me. I love the idea of just picking one habit at a time, because trying to, change cultures is super hard. So it feels like when you say, don't try to change everything all at once. Try to get better at one thing effectively. And finally, the last thing is, you've hammered home repeatedly, and I think it's really good. The key word in continuous discovery is continuous. It's not anybody can do project work, and there is value to that. But this idea of continuous discovery is super important. And as I'm coaching teams, I think the biggest challenge I have, and even on my own, when it comes to customer discovery and talking to customers, is just getting that habit, that continuous habit going. And this really helped from that. So a lot of great stuff here, but thank you.
I'll give my takeaways, and then you can let us know if we were misrepresenting anything that you covered, Teresa, and then we'll wrap it up. But so my takeaways, I also really like that very actionable one habit at a time. But on the other end of the spectrum, it does feel like that this is almost an operating system for the whole business. And I'm not sure how you get to that operating system, but that a business that operates this way feels like it would be a super powerful business, and that you should aspire to get to that, but you start the journey one habit at a time. Those were my takeaways. So did we misrepresent anything you said there, or miss anything that you feel like is also really important to emphasize before we wrap up?
No, I think those are both spot on. I'll just say on the dogma front, I'm kind of allergic to dogma. And selfishly, I wanted to write a timeless book. Right? So if you write a book about OKRs, that is not going to be a timeless book. And I think part of it came out of working with a lot of teams. I often say there's no right tool. There's a right tool for the right team. Mm-hmm. I think that's really true. And when you work with a lot of teams, you see the same thing doesn't work in every context. And so my goal was, what are those underlying guiding principles that help people pick the right tool for them? And that was my goal with the collection of habits. And then I think on the organizational change front, I actually went back and got a master's in learning and organizational change. And my takeaway from doing that master's was, nobody should focus on organizational change. It's impossibly hard. But there is one book that I read as part of that really stood out to me, and it's called Managing Transitions. It's by William Bridges. And what he talks about is when we go through a change, there's an ending, the thing that we're leaving behind, and then there's this messy transition period, and then there's the new beginning. And so if you're trying to inspire change, you have to manage those transitions. And when we talk about organizational change, there's this model of an organization is a thing and it's changing. I prefer the model of an organization as a group of people. And change happens when enough people in the organization change that everybody else is forced to come along. And so if I then combine those two things, okay, at the individual level, I have to go through this messy transition where I'm going to wander in what he calls a neutral zone until I figure out my new beginning, right? And enough people have to go through that messy change that the organization is pulled in that direction. Okay, if I'm a leader, I don't force people through those transitions. I support people as they go through those transitions, and they go through them on their own time.
Awesome.
As an individual contributor, I have almost zero impact on whether people go through that transition.
Yeah.
So this idea of like just focus on your own habits is just pragmatic. Like, I don't know what else you can do.
Yeah. Well, that definitely sounds like a book that I need to read. So that's on my list.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we could keep talking on this topic for a long time, but what we covered is amazing. So thank you so much for sharing your insights, and for everyone tuning in. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Breakout Growth Podcast. Please take a moment to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. And while you're at it, subscribe so you never miss a show. Until next week.